Good evening. On behalf of Paraclete Press, welcome again to our third talk in this series on stability. I'm just going to silence my phone, which is talking back to me now. Excuse me. Our series of live talks on stability, helping us to find inner peace and stillness this Lent, right where we are. My name is Rachel McKendry. I'm the book publicist here at Paraclete. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Our conversation this evening is with Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove. Welcome, Jonathan. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Good to see you.
Good to see you. So just by way of introduction, Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove is a celebrated spiritual writer and sought-after speaker. A native of North Carolina, he is a graduate of Eastern University and Duke Divinity School. In 2003, Jonathan and his wife, Leah, founded the Rutba House, a house of hospitality where the formerly homeless share community with the formerly housed. Jonathan directs the School for Conversion, a popular education center that works to make surprising friendships possible. He is also an associate minister at the historically Black St. John's Missionary Baptist Church, and he is the author of The Wisdom of Stability, Rooting Faith in a Mobile Culture. A recording of this evening's presentation will be available later on our YouTube channel for anyone who couldn't make it tonight. And I just ask everyone to take a moment to find the chat bar or the Q&A button. And please, we welcome you to submit any questions you might have for Jonathan through our conversation tonight. And we'll hope to get to everyone by the end of our hour together. These hours go very quickly, we've found. So thank you, Jonathan. And we're so excited to hear what you have to say to us about stability and growth.
Well, I'm glad to join the conversation. You've already had some great folks on here, people I've been learning from and with for years. But wow, what a time to talk about stability, huh? 2 years into what has been a kind of involuntary stability for many of us, sometimes more intense than others. But you know, it reminded me of how much I learned from a group of guys over at the Central Prison here in North Carolina, who invited me years ago to come and help facilitate a writing group. They had already organized the writing group. They knew they were writers, but they also knew that I had taught writing in the same prison in another block. And so they asked the head of psychology there if he would reach out and see if I would come over and join them. And I spent 4 years with those guys every week, a couple hours one afternoon a week. We were in that group and we read a lot of stuff together, read their pieces and workshopped things. And you know, being with them made me realize that when Abba Anthony says, "Go into your cell and your cell will teach you everything," he of course chose his cell. These were men who had not chosen to be behind bars, to be in a cell, but finding themselves there, they chose to redeem the time and to meet God in the place where they were, and to do the soul work that all of us can only do for ourselves, but can do when we choose to in community with other people. And they invited me into that community, and it was a blessing that I continue to be grateful for. So though some of our stability may not have been our choice in this season, I think we can nevertheless choose to learn from those who have practiced it as a discipline and to grow in it. My own journey to stability was sort of a boomerang track. I grew up in a farming community here in rural North Carolina and in the Baptist church there. And I suppose we were fairly stable in many ways as a community, though we didn't often talk about it that way. My dad has never lived anywhere other than the county where he was born. And that's not an uncommon experience for many people there. but, you know, as a kid who grew up there, who was frankly loved very well and affirmed by the church and the neighbors and the school, I had a lot of the same teachers at school that I had at church. You know, it's that small of a community. Um, I really wanted to get out of there and go do something. I don't know exactly how I got that message. I mean, I think, you know, people kind of said, you know, do your best, go off, you know, do. So by, you know, 16 years old, I was just eager to get out, and I traveled to South America and to Southern Africa with church groups as a teenager. I got appointed as a page in the U.S. Senate when I was a junior in high school. So I spent, you know, the fall on Capitol Hill. I learned there that you could, through the State Department, you could spend a year in Germany. The government would pay for it. My parents had the policy of, you know, as long as you can figure out how to pay for it, you're free to go for it. So I spent my senior year living in Germany, and then I went off to college in the Northeast. And you know, I was racking up the miles. I was seeing the world. I felt like I was going places, and that was important. And frankly, I think I had kind of imbibed the sort of default setting of our culture, which is go everywhere you can, see everything you can see, and above all things, I think this is probably the currency of our culture now, maybe even more important than money, although we do value money in this culture. I realized that the currency of our culture was experiences, you know, racking up experiences. Everybody sort of measures themselves by how many experiences we've had. And what happened, roundabout story here, was, as you mentioned, as a young adult, I had married in college, and Leah, my wife, and I were deeply impacted by again, another trip we made, a journey. We traveled halfway around the world, and were in Iraq in 2003 and experienced hospitality there. But we experienced it with a group of Christian peacemakers who had shown us in a powerful way. Most of them were a good 4 or 5 decades older than us, but this group had shown us in a powerful way what it could look like to be a witness for peace in the midst of war. And we were struck by the fact that all of those folks who were there and had been doing this work all of their lives, they were very rooted in communities, and their communities had sent them to do this work. And it just struck us that that seemed to be an important part of the witness that sort of shone out of them. There was one person in particular who we both were deeply moved by him and by the Spirit capital S, in him and in his presence there in the midst of a very difficult situation with, you know, bombs falling and people dying. A real instrument of peace, right? In the language that the prayer of St. Francis teaches us to pray, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Here was somebody who was, and he and others like him in that group were rooted in communities. So we wanted to root ourselves somewhere, and that's how we came to start this Rutba House, and we named it after the people in Rutba, Iraq, who had welcomed us when we were there. And we talked to some of our friends we'd gotten to know about how to do community, how to sustain community, and we had gotten some good advice, but we were 22 years old and frankly didn't know much. and yet we dove in, and some others joined us, and we were trying to make sense of how people could live in community based around their faith. And kind of right in the midst of that, as it was chaotic and we were trying to figure a lot of things out, we got a letter from the monks in Minnesota. They wrote and they said, we've heard that young people are living together in community, and that's encouraging to us because we don't have many young people around our communities these days. This is St. John's in Minnesota, which was at one time the largest Benedictine community in the US. And they went on to say, we know from experience that this living together in community can be difficult sometimes. And they said, we wanted to reach out and just let you know that if you ever want to talk about it, feel free to reach out. We've been at this 1,500 years. And so I visited there and am deeply grateful for many, many friends I made there, but especially for Abbot Timothy Kelly, who gracefully took me under his wing. I think he looked at me and he saw, as God sees in all of us, some potential. But I think, frankly, he also felt a little sorry for me, and he thought this young brother needs some direction. And so he would have lunch with me, and he gave me a copy of the Rule of Saint Benedict, and I began to learn Benedictine spirituality and to understand this commitment to stability as a practice, and the way, as the Benedictines taught me, that it's sort of part of a three-legged stool, that the obedience, the commitment to listen to God and to listen to one another in community is connected to the conversatio morum, the commitment to always being on a journey towards transformation, towards conversion, but that those happen in this dynamic balance with the other leg of stability, and that stability is a commitment to, while there's always dynamism, there's always change, there's always growth, to be planted in a way, to be grounded, like Psalm 1 says, like a tree planted by the water, to sort of have enough of a root system that you can tap into the deeper sources down there beneath, maybe sources that we have neglected in our rush to rack up experiences in the modern world. So I'm very grateful for that tradition, and I continue to learn from it and to chew on it. And yeah, delighted to get to talk to y'all about it. So thanks for having me. Maybe that's a long-winded way of saying how I got here, but good to be here.
It's so amazing to me over these few weeks of talking with people, which is, one of the strange blessings of this enforced stability of COVID, when we can't be traveling to talk to people. Here we all are in our own homes, still finding this blessing and talking with brothers and sisters around the world. So a surprise blessing, maybe. It's just amazing to me how people enter this journey from such different perspectives. It amazes me how God says this gift is for you, coming from all these different directions. I love it. So thanks for sharing that with us, for how you discovered it.
Oh, yeah. It was also, I'll say quickly, it was also a gift to me that I got to write a book about it. I'm certainly no expert, and I wasn't an expert by any means when I wrote that book, I guess a decade ago now. But it's the only book, I think I've written 14 or 15 books in my life. This is the only book that anyone ever reached out and asked me to write. I've always had to pitch books, but Paraclete called me, Pam, when she was publisher there, called me and said, we've heard from one of our friends that you think stability is important. I said, well, yeah, I have been learning this. She said, well, we want a book about it. And I said, well, I write books mostly to learn things. So I still have a lot to learn. Sure, I'll write a book. So it gave me a chance to dig through all of the all of the kind of Benedictine library on this, and to sort of put those sources in conversation with my own experiments in this. So that's she's no longer there, but y'all had at Paraclete a wonderful editor at the time, Lil Cotanis, and Lil and I argued a little bit when she was editing. Though she's a wonderful editor, it's a much better book than it would have been. But on this point, I won the argument. She she thought the little reflections on my front porch were sort of an interruption sometimes. So after a chapter on each theme, I kind of wrote a meditation from the porch, just kind of to root it in my own experience. And there are little vignettes scattered through the book. And if you get a chance to read it, you may, like Lil, feel like they don't all flow, but for me, they were important. So I argued to keep them in, and she let me.
Yeah, those were the experiences rooted in stability, as opposed to the experiences from wandering, I think. Probably part of what.
That's right. Yeah.
That's good. We, Sister Antonia and I were talking about this series ahead of time, and different themes that people have discovered in their journeys of learning about stability. And one of the challenges, I think, is letting yourself become known. Digging into relationships, especially living in community. So I wonder if there's something about those deeply rooted relationships and how that relates to spiritual growth in the context of stability.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of that story from the desert abbas, where he says that one of the brothers was strapping up his sandals, to leave in anger. He was wanting to get out of there. He was done with it. And the Abba says to him, if it is on my account you are leaving, then don't bother to go, because I go before you wherever you go. Which I think is a way of saying that maybe the hardest thing about other people is the way they reflect us to ourselves, and reflect the parts of us that we would rather be able to hide, or at least to only reveal, because it feels vulnerable to reveal these parts of ourselves. We'd like to only reveal them when we want to, when we go to spiritual direction, or when we're at the psychologist, when we're in a safe place, maybe we can open up that stuff. But you don't want to have your everyday arguments with people who know all of your stuff, and have to work with them and eat with them and deal with all over and over again. But alas, this is what God gives us, and I do think it's a gift. Especially for someone like me, it's been a gift. I don't know if you or folks who were on here ever used the Enneagram. You know the Enneagram?
I've never gone through the process, but I keep reading about it.
Kind of one of these personality type assessments, but it, at least many who have used it as a tool have tied it, I think, to an understanding, not just of personality, but also of people's sort of spiritual condition, and one thing, if you've done any soul work, one of the things about yourself is that your gifts are connected to your sins. This is the case for all of us, right? God makes us, and we're all gifted in particular ways, but that also is that is the clay vessel in which we live, and it's liable to have cracks in it, and the cracks often run where the vessel has been most used, or where we've been affirmed, or where we've used gifts. We also have so anyway, the Enneagram helps name that sometimes for people. So on that kind of a scale that it gives you, I am what in short form, what it calls the performer. Now, none of these titles are meant to be derogatory. They just describe, sort of the nature of your personality. So I'm an introverted person by nature. I spend a lot of time on my own. This is good for writers. Writers like to sort of hunker down and be alone with the page. But there's a part of my personality that sort of always has a a story to tell, or a way that I'd like to present myself to the neighbor, to the world, to whoever. It's kind of who I am. And if you are that kind of person, it's possible that you can bounce through the world sort of always presenting your best face to the people you happen to be with, performing in a sense, which of course, all of us need to do sometimes. If you work somewhere, you have performance reviews, performance is not all bad, but the people who know you, your spouse, your partner, your kids, your parents, people who know that there's more to who you are, and that that doesn't tell the whole story. And frankly, if you stay in a place and stay around people, they get to know that too. So I think it's humbling in its own way to sort of have to face the things that we might want to run from.
Mhm.
But I do think it's a gift that comes with stability.
Mhm. Mhm. Definitely.
Which is not to say, and I've grappled with this in particular because sometimes I think stability can even be presented or framed in a way that it becomes a kind of protective mechanism. So it's and I learned this from the Benedictines. To make a promise of stability is not to say that things will never change.
Yeah.
It's not to say that you are not vulnerable, as all of us are vulnerable to, the transience of society. I remember when I was working on the book, one person told me, stay anywhere and you'll be saying goodbye a lot, because the people around you will come and go, which is true.
Yeah.
So there's a dynamism, there's a vulnerability, there's an inevitability of change that's just part of being human. But I think stability is a tool that we can use in community with other people to focus ourselves on growing and developing in the place where we are, and in concert with the obedience, with the commitment to listen and to change as we listen, to possibly be sent somewhere. And that's the thing about, I grew up in the evangelical circles, and we were always regaled by the missionary stories.
Yes.
And the missionaries always quoted the prophet Isaiah, "Here I am, Lord, send me."
Yeah.
But here's the thing about being sent: if you don't belong to some people somewhere, you can't be sent. So much of the way that modern life has atomized people into this machine that's often driven by market desired, frankly, you know, and everybody's need to have some, you know, income from the marketplace because everybody's got to eat. Everybody, and so if everybody is atomized in this market where, you know, other human beings' desire is the main way that, you know, each of us can eat and pay our bills, then it kind of sends everybody bouncing in this direction or next, you know, trying to make it. And, you know, there's lots of good research that shows that has, especially over the last century, steadily degraded our communities. And when I think about my own life and when I listen to other people, a lot of the struggle with identity that people experience is a struggle to, of course, know who they are. That's what an identity struggle is. But it's often related to the fact that people don't know whose they are. They don't know who they belong to. How can I know who I am if I don't know who my people are?
Yeah.
You know, in the long human history, that would be a pretty fundamental understanding. You know, nobody for most of the history of the world thought they could know who they were apart from their people and their people's story. But here we are, you know, individuals who think we can land in any city or county in the world and, you know, get a job and have a home and figure out who we are.
Yeah.
Well, I think stability suggests that while it is possible to figure out who you are, part of that is going to be figuring out who you belong to, where you belong, what's your connections, and how do those connections with other people connect you to the God who made you in such a way that you know who you are as a particular beloved child of God. That happens in community, and I think stability is the invitation to do that work.
I love that. You know, Kathleen Norris was with us last week. I think she's here tonight, and she happened to write the foreword for your book.
Oh, if she is here, hello, Kathleen. I haven't
think
seen you in a long time, but I'm always grateful for you.
You know, she mentions in the foreword to the book, which I was rereading tonight, that how does she say it? Many of us consider stability tedious at best, and at its worst, that it restricts our freedom and limits our potential.
Yes.
If we stay the same, we're going to stagnate and become irrelevant. And yet, as you're saying, if we apply ourselves to stability, it's the only way we can achieve any growth over the long haul.
Yeah.
Oh, there she says, aloha from Honolulu, from her new stable place.
Oh,
Thanks,
wonderful, wonderful, good, so good. Oh yes, I mean that is, you've done so much with that insight, and it's at the center of everything you've written, and I'm so grateful for it. The way in which you've received the gift of tedium. I heard not long ago an interview that Jerry Lewis, you remember the comedian Jerry Lewis?
Oh yeah.
Jerry Lewis did this interview where he said, you know, in addition to his stand-up, he loved writing the scripts, you know, the line by line, what people were going to say, and, you know, stage directions and everything in the movies that he did. And the person who was interviewing said, but it's so tedious that, you know, you have to do every little detail. He said, oh, it's the tedium that I love. I love the tedium. I love it's getting into what dear sister Kathleen has called the quotidian mysteries, you know, the way that so much of the way our souls are shaped is that we have to be in a rhythm, and in a rhythm with other people, tied up in cycles, you know, that I mean, this is the heart of liturgical prayer. What is liturgical prayer but a wheel within a wheel within a wheel? It's an invitation into these rhythms, the way that human beings in our spirits have breathed together, you know, rising to meet the sun, pausing at midday, you know, bowing down before we lay our bodies down, like the Desert Mothers and Fathers says, digging a shovel full of your grave every night before you go to bed, because remember, you came from the dust, to the dust you will return. We've got a little bit of time between the cradle and the grave. And what are you going to do with this time? How are you going to grow, you know, into an understanding of who God has made you to be? That's all in the tedium. It's all in the rhythm of working it out. Whether you're sweeping the floor, washing the dishes with Brother Lawrence, whatever you're doing, like it's in the midst of the rhythms that we find the mystery, and it's all mystery. I don't know how to understand it, but but increasingly, I feel like I can sing it. I feel like it's in the song, you know, the song that is the rhythm that, of course, you know, comes out in the songs that we sing, and it's sort of suggested and points us toward the eternal song. But I'll never forget when my friends Shane Claiborne and Enuma Okoro and I were working on a liturgy. We met with Sister Phyllis Tickle, who has crossed over to the Communion of Saints since then. But when we met with her, she had done her Divine Hours several years before that. And so we were just talking about the logistics of this and sort of the, you know, inner workings of how do you, not just how do you write a liturgy, but, you know, publishing it and the various concerns and issues that come up. And I remember she paused and looked at us very seriously, and she said, listen here. You know, like a mama. She said,
hear her voice.
yeah. And she was a mama to 7 children. She said, listen here. This is serious business. If you're writing liturgy, she said, you're messing around with the eternal song that's sung around the throne of God.
True.
And I said, amen. I'll take it seriously. But yeah, that song, like all song, it's you have to learn it by getting into the rhythm. And I think you know, a lot of us want to pop in and do this here and do this there, but to some degree, you got to have a lot of choir practice. You got to have a lot of coming back to the same old standards, to the same old classics, for them to get inside of you and you to get inside of them in a way that I think lifts us into something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. True.
Again, I'm talking about something I don't entirely understand. So what do we do when we speak of mystery? I guess we look for metaphor.
Absolutely.
It's getting darker here in North Carolina.
I see that. The sun's gone down. You know, I was telling Jonathan before we began that we have such a variety of attendees for these talks, which is wonderful. We have a lot of people with sister, brother, father before their names, but we have a lot of us who don't. So, you know, monastics vow stability, like you're saying, conversion, stability, obedience. But there are a lot of people who seem to be hungering for this outside of the monastery. And I think about the additional challenges we have when we are not actually vowed to the people we live with or to the place we are. And the two big temptations: one, the temptation to run away, the temptation to flee for whatever reason. And then two, when the people that we become attached to go away. And what do we do in those situations? You know, you can make a choice to stay, but how do we proceed on that path of growth through stability when it's not a guarantee with the people or places that we find ourselves in or with?
Yeah. Well, I've come to understand stability, and I think the tradition has taught me this as ultimately about finding a way to root ourselves in what is eternal. because frankly, everything else changes.
Yeah.
All of us are just here for a little while, and some of us bounce around a lot while we're here.
Yeah.
So yeah, things are going to change, but I love how Howard Thurman said it. He said, at the center of every person, there is an island. And at the center of that island, there is an altar. And at the center of that altar, there is a flame. Thurman said, the contemplative life is about making sure you're always in touch with that flame. He thought about it a lot in terms of aliveness. You know, God is, of course, revealed to us in Scripture. God is present in, the very present, I think, often in the flesh of other people. Jesus indeed promised to be present to us in the person who knocks at our door. So there are lots of ways we can expect to meet God, but Thurman emphasized the way that the God of life is always present in life, and that life itself has a way of sustaining itself. And to some degree, I think what he called the contemplative life, and what is connected, I think, always to stability, is this basic question of how do we get grounded? How do we get centered in ourselves in such a way that we are in touch with the source of life? That's the flame at the center of the altar, on the island that's in the center of the self. And I think stability is a means of staying in touch with that.
Yeah.
Not for its own sake. Again, I think it's about the tree puts down its roots not because the tree finds roots to be nice or help them look better or something, but the roots go down to find the water, to find the nutrients. That's what they're there for. And I think, likewise, we're trying to get in touch with our source.
Yeah. I love that. There's a quote from Bernard that you included in the book: "For I can make no progress in my own strength, so those roots go down to find the source." It's good.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that on the cover of this book. I don't know who designed it, but there's just as much roots as there is tree branches and trunk.
Yeah. Isn't that something?
So good.
I learned that at one point about trees. I think an arborist told me this, that if you look at a tree, you look at a big tree, the reach of its branches above, in the sky above you, is always roughly mirrored by the reach of its roots underneath, because otherwise it would fall over, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's
Awesome.
I do appreciate that art. Very, very nice art. If you find out who did it there, please thank them.
I'll try to do some research. You're kind of joking about the monastic digging a shovel full of their own grave every night, but we're talking about stability and letting go or dying in order to live again. And in the book, you tell the story of a friend who was a record-setting runner in his youth, who had to get tired before learning to rest in the Lord. And you said, "We die to live again, stand still to move on." And I wondered if you would share some of what you've learned in letting some things go or die in order to make room for new growth, sort of like being pruned.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is even our vision and understanding of what this community here was when we started is not what it is now. And that has meant having to die and reimagine our life together many times, frankly. And I've often come back to, in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Life Together, he has a line that says the Wunschentraum, the dream of community, the wish dream of community, is the enemy of all real community, he says. And I think that's true. It's probably also true of a lot of what we think about ourselves, to the extent that we think we control our lives, and the other people in our lives who we sometimes believe we can control or make. Nothing teaches you this like being a parent, right? To have people who you think you understand what they need to do to become who they need to be, and you all of us put a lot of effort into what we think is what needs to happen, and we are inevitably frustrated, and it's sometimes it's stubborn kids. I have stubborn kids. Sometimes it is stubbornness, and sometimes it's cluelessness. They don't know who they are, who they're becoming, and I don't entirely either. and sometimes it's just the fact that there's a lot we don't know, none of us. so yeah, there's an opportunity for growth. Eugene Peterson had this great book called Like Do Their Youth. Have you ever seen it?
I think so.
I think it's the only parenting book I've ever thought was any good. I hate parenting books. All these like, let me tell you what I learned and how to do it. Anyway, they've always felt rather prescriptive to me. But I remember reading his book, and the main point of it made several. I mean, he always had nice ways of reading the scriptures, but the main point of the book was what I've learned from being a parent is that if you take your kids seriously as human beings created in the image of God, they'll change you. God will ultimately help them figure out how and when and what they'll become. But if you take them seriously and you take your prayer and work with them seriously, it will change you. And that I know to be true from experience.
No question. Yeah. No question. Jonathan, I'm wondering if we should start taking questions from people now, if that's okay with you.
Oh yeah.
We've got some good ones here in the chat bar.
Chime in the chat, or can you?
Yeah, they're in the chat, and I'm happy. I can give them to you.
Okay.
Rebecca says inner and outer stability. Does one come before the other, and how are they related?
Yeah, that's a good question. They are related. I don't know that it's always predictable exactly how, or exactly what the relationship will look like. I just, for example, I know people who, because of the circumstances in which they were born or in which they landed at a young age, things that they didn't choose in any way, just have lived with and dealt with incredible instability. And, by an amazing grace, some of these folks have, the most rooted and grounded spirit of anyone you'll ever know. And, it's, I stand in awe of it. It's evident to look at their lives that they could not have survived without it.
Yeah.
And so there must be some connection, between the two. The one is obviously compensating for the lack of stability in the other. But of course, that's not a prescription. You know, knowing some of these stories, I wouldn't wish it on anyone.
Right.
And on the other hand, there are stories of people who have had to make very conscious and sometimes difficult decisions to practice a more outward stability. Sometimes at great sacrifice. Doesn't just mean that you're not going to keep racking up experiences. Sometimes it means that you give up some opportunity. I think I haven't looked at back in a while. I think I told the story in the book of Gordon Cosby, but I very well remember him telling me the story of how, when he was a young minister in DC with a thriving congregation, he had this kind of, moment of whatever you call it, Christian stardom or whatever, where he kind of felt like he had this opportunity to go and see and do and work with people everywhere. And in the midst of that, he was praying one day and he heard God say, stay home and do your knitting. That was the message. Stay home and do your knitting. He was not in the practice of knitting with yarn, so he understood that this had to be a metaphor, and he eventually understood that it was a real call to stability, to turn down the opportunities and the invitations to do things in other places so that he could stay with these people that he was called to work with, and in the neighborhood where they were called to be, and to really knit lives and visions and projects together. And he was in his 80s when I met him, and he told me that story. But it was beautiful to be able to walk around the neighborhood and look around with him and see all the things that had grown out of that work, that knitting that he had done. So I suspect there was some kind of inner stability that allowed him to be attentive enough to that voice that he was able to grow in practicing an outward stability. So yes, there is a relationship, but far be it for me to understand it well enough to sketch out a diagram.
Yeah. Maybe that's the next book.
I'm not real great with diagrams.
Helena's question is, I think maybe sort of a part B to that first question, because she, you talked about, I love that image of the flame on the inner altar and the roots that have to sink deep to find the source. Helena asks, for a person who has lost all community, could you please further elaborate on how to find stability without community?
Yeah. Well, I'll say it can be really hard to be in a lonely place. And people lose community for lots of reasons. Sometimes it's tragedy. Sometimes it's what looks like the normal course of life. You're here and you're all connected to all sorts of people, and then all of a sudden they're gone on to other things. There are, of course, times in people's lives when they experience this more naturally. Someone who's an undergraduate in college, all connected with all these people they've gotten over the last few years. Then everyone graduates, and what? And sometimes people's connections and community unravel in their hands because of decisions they've made. Sometimes, decisions they recognize were very bad decisions, but here they are. So I recognize that there are lots of ways that we can find ourselves in that lonely place. But I guess what I would say is that I do think through prayer and through contemplative practice, we always have the opportunity to come back to the source. By grace, I think that invitation is always there. It doesn't matter the reason why. That's the beautiful thing about grace. It doesn't matter really if it was your fault, if it was someone else's fault, if it was no one's fault, if it just happened. The invitation is always there. And I really do believe that if we accept it, if we accept the invitation, and if we commit in concrete ways to keep coming back to it, that's different for different people. Maybe it's a walk every morning to a place where you're able to ground yourself. Maybe it's a prayer practice. Maybe it's a time of fellowship with other people in a new community, that a church down on the corner, or some book group that meets in your town. I don't know. There are lots of ways it happens. I've heard lots of stories, but I do believe if we accept the invitation and commit to regularly come back to that place and that way that God is meeting us, that creates community. It builds the very sinews that knit the beloved community together. So yeah, I pray for everyone who's in lonely places, but I pray that all of us, when we're in those places, have the courage and the will to keep coming back to the source, to get into the rhythm, however we find it. And I also want to say that I feel like I've learned this walking with people. A lot of people somehow along the way picked up the idea that there's some right way to get into the rhythm. I think there are certain kinds of piety that sort of suggest, and all of our religious communities probably do this unintentionally, by trying to train up a child in the way they should go. You teach people ways that other people have found God. All of that is with the best of intentions. It's all good. But I have noticed that it creates, at least in some people, this notion that there's the right way to do this. And, if that right way doesn't work for me, people will say, well, I'm not very spiritual, or if they're a Christian, I'm not a good Christian, or I'm not a good Muslim, whatever their tradition. And I think often those are people who simply haven't found their way of connecting to the source. So I think God created us in diverse enough forms that there are lots of ways. And I've seen lots of ways. I've seen people who practice lots of ways. I really love, it's been a great gift to me. There's a woman named Barbara Holmes. Do you know that name, Barbara Holmes?
Yeah.
Barbara Holmes has been writing recently about the communal practices of contemplation that come out of the Black church tradition in America. And I think it's just fascinating because it's a little counterintuitive, especially for those of us, who kind of know the contemplative literature, have so much of Western monastic contemplative stuff is very individual. And I think it's just a beautiful exploration she's done. Her book on this is called Unspeakable Joy. And it's just a beautiful exploration of the way communities have practiced contemplation together. And you might have never been part of a community like that, but it's at least a reminder to me that there are many, many ways.
Yeah. Thank you. I think this might be our last question. Nathan says, I've been surprised at the intensity of the responses to the call to stability. People seem to need to say, but staying isn't always the best option. And of course, we know that. But the call to stay is the quieter call in the culture, isn't it? And he asks Jonathan, what is your response to people's apparent knee-jerk reaction against the call to stability? How do you coach people who are asking, stay or go?
Well,
That's a big one.
My immediate thought is something that John Perkins told me years ago. John was a minister down in Mississippi during the civil rights movement who has just continued ministering in the community, and he built this network called the Christian Community Development Association. So he has connected over the years with people all over the world, really. And I remember I was at his house one day in Jackson, Mississippi, and he said, Brother Jonathan, he said, I get a lot of people who come by here and tell me that God told them to do something and they want to come talk to me about it. And he said, I've about decided that whenever somebody comes and tells me God told them to do something, I'm just going to tell them, if God already told you, you don't need to talk to me about it. So my first thought is that I don't really try to coach anybody who doesn't really want to sort of, invite me onto their journey. If you don't think you're called to stay, well, you're probably not going to. And if you don't want to know how to stay, I don't want to spend too much time worrying about it with you. But I think you're probably, Nathan, getting at a genuine wrestling that a lot of people do have, which is that, yes, they can see the value of committing to a place, committing to people, committing to an institution, but they also see the potential value of, responding to some other opportunity. And, I guess the most fruitful thing I think that we could say from the perspective of stability is that if there are relationships in which you are able to have that conversation with someone else, that is stability. Like that is a connection. That is that's a strand of the sort of root stream that is allowing someone to work out in relationship, what they think is best and where God might be in it. And all I can say, and generally speaking, is that we should thank God for those conversations. Like whenever it's a genuine question, and it's not someone coming to tell you what God told them to do. When somebody comes to tell you what God told them to do, they usually want to ask you for some money. But if they're genuinely wanting to discern with you or with your community or with anyone else, like, what is the best way forward for me at this moment? That's the kind of conversation you have in real community. Yeah. And the answer is usually, I don't know, but let's talk about it together. Let's try to, let's try to listen to the Spirit together.
Yep. Thank you. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. These hours literally just fly by. Wish we had longer together, but so grateful that you were willing to join us for the series. Thank you.
It's a delight. I'm honored to be part of this series. I don't know if I saw that question was from Brother Nathan. Is he already gone?
No, he says, thank you. Good word.
But I mean, he's in this series too, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
I've read his book on stability.
Oh, good.
So lots of great folks to be in conversation with. We're all in different places, but hey, the Zoom room can bring us together. So
Sure does.
thanks to Paraclete for getting us all together.
Oh, our pleasure and our privilege. Just to remind everybody that all these fantastic books that we're privileged to have at Paraclete, Jonathan's book, Nathan's book, Mike O'Brien's book from last week, and many others on stability and other aspects of Benedictine spirituality. We always want you to go to your local bookstore first, but they're available lots of places. And if you want to visit our website, which is paracletepress.com, you can use a special coupon code for this Lent, stability, and you'll receive a 20% off discount from those books. They're fantastic reading, especially as I guess we're almost at the midpoint of Lent, but a few more weeks for some good reading on stability before Easter time. Also, just to remind you that we have another talk coming up on April 6th. We get to talk with Father Ron Rollheiser. He's written a fantastic little book called Domestic Monastery, and just super practical and compassionate advice on how you can, bring the life of the monastery into the home, families, kids, married, work, all those things that we might see as impediments. He has just wonderful ways to teach us how we can make it work. So that's a talk on stability and the family. So we hope you can join us for that one. And that's on April 6th. And we're at the end of our hour and beyond it. So I'll say thank you to you again, Jonathan. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks
you. And thanks to everybody who joined us.
Wonderful. And I hope you all have a blessed evening. I'm saving the chat bar, everybody, so that I can pass on all the comments that you've been sending in. Thanks for those. And hope you have a blessed evening. Good night.
Good night, all.